The Grand Callahan estate was a monument to power. It stood on acres of pristine land, its towering walls hiding not just wealth but secrets. From the outside, the Callahans appeared to be a family bound by tradition and success. But inside, behind closed doors, cracks had begun to form. And tonight, Zephyr Callahan found the biggest one. The study was quiet, save for the faint sound of the fireplace crackling in the corner. Zephyr sat in his father's chair, his fingers tapping absently against the wooden desk. Before him lay a thin manila folder, neat, unassuming. But inside, it carried the weight of his entire existence. He had read the words a dozen times already, yet they still felt foreign. Zephyr Callahan is not the biological son of Dorian Callahan. A pit formed in his stomach. His breath was slow, measured, but beneath his composed exterior, his thoughts raced. Not his son. His mind tried to reject it, to twist the meaning into something else. But the DNA test results left no room for doubt. Dorian had known. He had known for decades, yet he had never said a word. Zephyr had spent his entire life trying to meet the impossible standards his father set. He had endured the cold glances, the dismissive nods, the endless cycle of proving himself. And now, he knew why nothing had ever been enough. Because he wasn't enough. Because he wasn't his. A bitter laugh nearly escaped his lips, but he swallowed it down. The pieces of his life were rearranging themselves, and with them came something darker, something far more dangerous than just the sting of betrayal. Fear. For the first time, he was afraid. He had grown up believing that one day, when Dorian Callahan was gone, everything would be his. The wealth, the empire, the power. He had never doubted it. But now he wasn't sure of anything. What if Dorian had plans to cut him out? What if, when the time came, he left everything to someone else? A distant relative? A business partner? A hidden heir? Zephyr could already picture it. The lawyers standing in the vast Callahan estate, reading out the will. His name nowhere to be found. His life, his future, slipping through his fingers. No, he had spent too long playing the role of the perfect son. He had worked too hard for it all to be taken away from him. He wouldn't let that happen. His fingers curled into a fist. If Dorian Callahan wouldn't ensure his place in this empire, then Zephyr would make sure he had won. By any means necessary. The next few days passed with painstaking normalcy. Zephyr went through the motions, attending business meetings, dining with his family, exchanging pleasantries. But beneath the surface, a plan was beginning to form. He needed certainty. The first step was figuring out exactly where he stood in Dorian's will. That meant speaking to August Fairchild, the family lawyer. August had been with the Callahans for years, trusted, loyal, meticulous. If there was anyone who knew Dorian's legal affairs, it was him. So, one evening, Zephyr arranged a meeting. Not in the Grand Callahan estate, but in a quiet, exclusive club in the city, one where no one would overhear their conversation. August arrived precisely on time, dressed in his usual three-piece suit, his sharp eyes scanning Zephyr with quiet curiosity. "Mr. Callahan," he greeted as he took a seat across from him. Zephyr gave him an easy smile, though his mind was already working. "August, I'll get straight to the point. My father, he isn't as young as he used to be. I assume he has his affairs in order." August adjusted his cufflinks. "Of course. Your father is a man of preparation. His estate, his assets, everything has been accounted for." Zephyr leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "And his will?" August hesitated. "That's privileged information, Zephyr." Zephyr held his gaze. "I'm not asking for specifics, August. I just need to know, am I in it?" The lawyer exhaled slowly, considering his words. Then, with careful deliberation, he spoke. "Your father has made certain adjustments over the years." The moment the words left his lips, Zephyr's stomach twisted. Adjustments. That meant change. That meant uncertainty. He forced his expression to remain neutral. Adjustments. August hesitated again before nodding. "Your father's legacy is vast. He has many interests, many assets, some of which he has chosen to." He paused, as if selecting the right phrase. "Redistribute." Zephyr clenched his jaw. Redistribute to who? August offered him a polite, non-committal smile. "I'm afraid I can't say." Zephyr leaned back in his chair, inhaling sharply. But he already knew. It wasn't him. Dorian was preparing for a future that didn't include Zephyr Callahan. He masked the fury rising in his chest, giving August a tight smile. Of course. I understand. The lawyer nodded. If there's anything else I can. No. Zephyr cut in smoothly, already rising from his seat. That'll be all, August. Thank you for your time. August regarded him carefully before standing as well. Good evening, Zephyr. Zephyr forced himself to remain composed as he walked out of the club. But the moment he stepped into his car, his mask slipped. His fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His worst fear had just been confirmed. Dorian Callahan had never planned to leave him anything. Everything he had worked for, everything he had endured, it was all slipping away. Unless he took it. Dorian was the only thing standing in his way. The only obstacle between him and the power he deserved. And if he wasn't his real father, then Zephyr had no obligation to let him live. That night, as he sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, Zephyr made his decision. Dorian Callahan had to die. Not immediately. Not carelessly. It had to be perfect, an accident, a tragedy, something no one could ever trace back to him. And when it was done, everything would finally belong to him. The plan was simple in theory. Dorian Callahan was not an easy man to kill. He was powerful, cautious, and surrounded by people who depended on him. If anything were to happen to him, there would be an investigation. People would ask questions. That meant Zephyr couldn't be reckless. No sudden violence. No impulsive outbursts. This had to look natural. A tragedy. Something that no one, not the police, not the business world, not even his mother, would ever suspect was orchestrated. And so, the first step was patience. Zephyr returned to the Callahan estate the following morning as if nothing had changed. He greeted his mother with a polite nod, exchanged cold pleasantries with Dorian, and sat through an excruciating breakfast of empty conversation. But behind his calm exterior, his mind was already at work. He needed leverage. Dorian had made adjustments to his will. Zephyr knew that much. But he still didn't know who the new heir was. That meant he was operating on uncertainty, and uncertainty was dangerous. So he started digging. Not openly, of course. That would be foolish. Instead, he played the part of the dutiful son, attending business meetings, sitting in on board discussions, gradually reacquainting himself with the financial workings of the empire he intended to claim. And then, after 2 weeks of careful observation, he found it. A name. Nikolai Laurent. Zephyr frowned when he first came across it in the company's legal documents. Nikolai wasn't a Callahan. He wasn't family. So why was his name appearing in sensitive documents? He did more digging. And what he uncovered sent a chill through him. Nikolai Laurent wasn't just some business associate. He was a trustee. And more than that, he had been granted control over certain Callahan assets in the event of Dorian's passing. Zephyr clenched his fists as realization sank in. This was it. This was the man Dorian had chosen to replace him. The pieces fit together perfectly now. Dorian had always been methodical, always thinking 10 steps ahead. He hadn't needed to tell Zephyr that he was being replaced. He had already made the arrangements behind his back. If Dorian died today, Zephyr wouldn't inherit a single cent. And that meant one thing. Dorian couldn't just die. Zephyr needed to eliminate Nikolai too. Killing 2 men was far more complicated than killing one. Zephyr needed a way to make it all look seamless. An accident wouldn't be enough. Dorian Callahan was a public figure. If he suddenly fell ill or suffered a fatal mishap, there would be suspicions. But a murder-suicide? A scandal. Something the public would eat up, but more importantly, something that would close the case immediately. And if he framed Nikolai Laurent as the culprit, then not only would Dorian be dead, but so would the man who stood between Zephyr and his inheritance. It was brilliant. A flawless setup. Now, all that was left was execution. Zephyr spent the next few weeks watching Nikolai, studying his habits, his movements. Unlike Dorian, Nikolai was careless. A businessman, yes, but not a strategist. He had no idea that he had been marked for death. Zephyr made his first move subtly. He arranged for a private meeting between Dorian and Nikolai at a secluded estate outside the city, a property owned by the Callahan family, but rarely used. It was the perfect location. Remote. Isolated. The invitation came from Dorian's assistant, who, with a small financial incentive from Zephyr, had ensured that neither man suspected a thing. It would be just the two of them. And Zephyr? He would be watching. Waiting. It was raining the night Dorian Callahan arrived at the estate. The storm clouds rolled in like a bad omen, casting shadows over the sprawling vineyard that surrounded the house. Zephyr was already there, hidden. He had planned everything down to the smallest detail. The cameras had been disabled. The security staff had been conveniently reassigned elsewhere for the night. And inside the house, a gun lay waiting. Not in Zephyr's hands. No, that would be too obvious. Instead, it was waiting for Nikolai Laurent, planted in his private study, where it would be found after everything was over. The scene was meticulously arranged. Zephyr would let the two men argue, push Nikolai into panic. He had already left behind just enough evidence to make it seem as though Nikolai had been embezzling from the Callahan estate, something that would make Dorian furious. When the confrontation reached its peak, when the tempers flared, Zephyr would make his move. A single shot. A perfect kill. Nikolai would be left with the murder weapon. His fingerprints would be on it. The perfect fall guy. And just like that, Zephyr would be the last one standing. The only heir left. But Zephyr hadn't accounted for one thing. Dorian Callahan was not a fool. The moment he stepped into that room, the moment he saw the fear in Nikolai's eyes, something in him clicked. He turned toward the darkened corner of the room, where Zephyr had been standing. And then, in the coldest, most chilling voice Zephyr had ever heard, Dorian spoke. "I know you're here, Zephyr." The words sent a shock through his system. For the first time, in all his careful planning, in all his calculated moves, Zephyr hesitated. And in that hesitation, everything collapsed. A sudden movement. A struggle. The sound of a chair crashing to the ground. And then, a gunshot. Silence. Zephyr's breath came in ragged gasps as he stepped forward, his hands trembling. Nikolai lay motionless, blood pooling beneath him. But Dorian was still standing. His father turned toward him, the look in his eyes unreadable. And then, in a voice calm and cold, he asked the question Zephyr had feared his entire life. "Was it ever about the money, Zephyr? Or did you just want me dead?" Zephyr's breath was shallow. His pulse thundered in his ears. The plan had gone wrong. Dorian Callahan still stood before him, watching, analyzing, not with shock, not with fear, but with cold, calculated knowing. "Was it ever about the money, Zephyr? Or did you just want me dead?" The words slithered through the dimly lit room, wrapping around Zephyr's throat like a noose. Nikolai Laurent lay motionless at his feet, blood soaking into the expensive Persian rug. The gun in Zephyr's hand felt like dead weight. His fingers trembled slightly, but he clenched them tight, forcing himself to stay composed. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Nikolai was meant to be the fall guy, the scapegoat. But now Dorian knew. He knew everything. Zephyr steadied his breath. Think fast. If Dorian was still alive, then there was only one solution left. He had to finish it. He had to pull the trigger. Slowly, he raised the gun, leveling it at his father's chest. "You're going to die tonight, Dorian," he said, voice low and steady. "No one is coming to save you." Dorian didn't move. He didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow step forward. "Go on then," he murmured. "Pull the trigger." Zephyr's grip tightened. Dorian's voice was calm, eerily so. "I'm curious, though, was this always the plan? Or did you only decide to kill me after you realized you weren't in my will?" The word struck like a bullet straight to his skull. Zephyr stiffened. Dorian let out a low chuckle. "Oh, Zephyr, you think I didn't see this coming?" His heart pounded. "You're bluffing." Dorian's eyes darkened. "Am I?" And then, before Zephyr could react, a gunshot rang out. But it wasn't his. Pain. A searing, white-hot pain tore through Zephyr's shoulder. He staggered back, gripping his arm as his own blood dripped onto the floor. Dorian Callahan stood before him, holding a gun. Zephyr's mind reeled. How did he? And then, through the haze of pain, he saw it. A hidden weapon, tucked beneath Dorian's coat. He had been prepared. Zephyr's breathing turned ragged. He had walked into a trap. Dorian had known all along. Zephyr stumbled back, pressing himself against the desk, struggling to hold his grip on the gun. His vision swam with pain, but he forced himself to focus. He had one shot left, but before he could raise his weapon, Dorian fired again. The bullet missed, but only because Zephyr had managed to move in time. It shattered the glass cabinet behind him, raining sharp shards across the floor. Zephyr dropped his gun. The metal clattered against the wood, spinning uselessly out of reach. He was unarmed, vulnerable. And Dorian? Dorian hadn't even broken a sweat. "Did you really think you could outmaneuver me?" Dorian said coolly, stepping closer. That you, a boy with a stolen name, could take everything I built? Zephyr's chest rose and fell in shallow, painful breaths. But his eyes burned with rage. You never planned to leave me anything, he spat. You were cutting me out of my own inheritance. Dorian exhaled, a look of disappointment flickering across his face. You still don't get it, do you? Silence stretched between them. And then, finally, Dorian said the words that shattered the last piece of Zephyr's world. You were never meant to inherit the Callahan fortune, Zephyr, because you were never meant to be a Callahan at all. The words hit harder than the bullets. Zephyr stared, his mind struggling to process. What are you saying? Dorian took another step forward. His voice was quieter now, sharper. You weren't just adopted, he said. You were a mistake. A debt I paid. A burden I carried. And do you know why I never treated you as my heir? Zephyr swallowed, his hands shaking. Why? Dorian's lips curled into something cold. Because your real father tried to kill you. The air in Zephyr's lungs vanished. His vision blurred. No, that's not. You think you were some abandoned orphan? Dorian continued. That your mother brought you into my life because she loved you? A dark chuckle. She brought you to me because she had nowhere else to go. Because the man who gave you life tried to end it. Zephyr froze. It couldn't be true. It couldn't be true. But deep inside him, something snapped. A long-buried memory, a whisper of something he had always ignored, rose to the surface. A gunshot. A man's voice shouting. His mother's desperate cries. Blood. Zephyr's entire body shook. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Dorian watched him crumble before his eyes. And then, in a final, crushing blow, he said, You never had a future here, Zephyr. And now, you never will. Zephyr's knees buckled. For the first time in his life, he realized he had already lost. His father had played him like a pawn, had seen every move before it was made. And worst of all, he had been living a lie far greater than he had ever imagined. His fingers twitched. His body screamed for him to move, to do something. But before he could react, Dorian pulled the trigger one last time. A sharp pain exploded through Zephyr's side. His vision spun. And then, darkness. When Zephyr awoke, he wasn't in the Callahan estate. He was in a prison cell. His head throbbed. His body ached. And in front of him, behind the cold steel bars, stood Seraphina Callahan. His mother. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale. But when she spoke, her voice was firm. Dorian spared your life, she whispered. But you will never be free again, Zephyr. Zephyr didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. He had lost everything. His father, his inheritance, his freedom. And worst of all, he had lost himself. The cold walls of the prison cell pressed in on Zephyr Callahan from all sides. The dim light flickered overhead, casting long, restless shadows. The air smelled of damp concrete and faded regret. He sat on the narrow cot, staring at the floor, motionless, silent. Days had passed since the trial. Weeks, maybe. Time had lost meaning. The court had been swift in delivering its verdict. Attempted murder. Conspiracy. Premeditated crime. There was no way out. He had been sentenced to 25 years to life. Zephyr barely reacted when the judge announced his fate. What was there to say? His father had beaten him. His plan had crumbled. And now, the world had moved on without him. But the worst part? The silence. No visits. No letters. His mother hadn't come back since that first day. Seraphina Callahan had walked away, just as he had feared she always would. And Dorian? Dorian was alive. Untouchable. As if none of this had ever happened. Zephyr clenched his fists. He had lost. Completely. One evening, as he sat in his cell, lost in thought, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence. A guard stopped outside his cell door. You have a visitor, he said gruffly. Zephyr didn't move. The door buzzed open, and a figure stepped inside. His heart stopped. Dorian Callahan. Still sharp. Still cold. Still the man who had destroyed him. Zephyr forced himself to breathe. He didn't stand. Didn't react. Dorian pulled up a chair, sitting across from him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, in a quiet voice, Dorian said, You should have been smarter. Zephyr's jaw clenched. And you should have been a better father. Dorian exhaled, unbothered. I was never your father. The words cut. Even now. Dorian studied him. But you had a choice, Zephyr. You could have walked away. Zephyr laughed, bitter and hollow. Walked away from what? From the empire I spent my life preparing to inherit. Dorian's gaze darkened. You were never going to inherit it. Zephyr's fists tightened. Then why keep me around? Dorian leaned forward. Because I owed your mother. And because, whether you like it or not, you were still my responsibility. The silence stretched. Dorian's voice softened, just slightly. You could have built a life for yourself, Zephyr. Without me. Without the Callahan name. Zephyr hated the way those words felt like an accusation. Like a truth he had refused to accept. He looked away. Why are you here? Dorian stood, straightened his coat. I wanted to see if there was anything left of you, he said simply. But I don't think there is. And with that, he turned and walked out of the cell. Zephyr didn't call after him, didn't beg. He just sat there, alone. Years passed. Zephyr faded into the background of the prison system, just another name in a long list of forgotten criminals. There were no appeals, no second chances. Dorian Callahan never returned. Serafina never wrote. The world outside continued. Without him, Zephyr changed. The arrogance, the cold confidence, it all rotted away. By the time a decade had passed, he was barely a shadow of the man he had once been. It wasn't until 20 years later that he was finally granted parole. By then, the world had changed. Dorian Callahan was dead. The empire had passed into other hands. The Callahan name had continued, but without him. No one was waiting when he stepped outside the prison gates. No family, no home, nothing. For the first time, Zephyr Callahan was truly alone. With nowhere else to go, Zephyr found himself in front of a grave. Dorian Callahan's tombstone stood tall and unshaken, just like the man had been in life. Zephyr stared at it for a long time. And then, with a quiet, empty voice, he murmured, "You won, old man." The wind carried his words into the silence. And for the first time in his life, Zephyr walked away.